Hi everybody, welcome to week 7 of motor control and learning. So this week we're going to dig into a theory called reinvestment theory and implicit learning. So we'll be revisiting some concepts in a bit more detail that are linked to week 6 as we progress into the next phase of the semester. So we'll be learning about this concept called reinvestment theory, and we'll be linking it to the phenomena of choking in sport, for instance, where people perform at a level that is worse than what should be expected given their skill level. And we'll be looking at different applications and ways of preventing choking by using various strategies during practice in order to do this. So these are the learning outcomes for this week. Please take a moment to read through them before you get into the lecture. In terms of what I want you to be thinking about is for this week, these 3 basic questions. Can you learn without being able to remember? Can people who have previously learnt a skill implicitly start to learn explicitly? And why would this happen? And how can you help people safely learn implicitly? So reinvestment theory, it's a theory that underpins research that's shown that we can learn things implicitly. And when we do this, we can prevent choking. So it's a framework that addresses this practical issue of how can we learn in such a way as to prevent or reduce the likelihood that we're going to choke in some high pressure situation. And it relates to these findings that when we are anxious or we're put under pressure and it causes an increase in some level of anxiety, we tend to start to try to use verbalizable explicit rules which we've previously learned. And this, by doing so, can cause us to choke or for our performance to deteriorate. So what reinvestment argues is that we can learn motor skills implicitly. So, and when we do this, it can prevent choking. So, implicit motor learning, what it is, it's the acquisition of a new motor skill without a corresponding increase in verbalizable or declarative knowledge about that skill that we're learning. That's the definition of implicit learning. So when we learn implicitly, a motor skill is acquired without an early engagement of working memory during this process. When we have a situation of where reinvestment occurs, what's happening is automatized motor processes become disrupted, particularly when some conscious control process starts to occur, when the person starts to try to use declarative, verbalizable, explicit knowledge, which typically takes place during the verbal cognitive stage of learning, that very first stage of learning. So reinvestment is when we've become quite skilled, we're now automatic, but for whatever reason, we go back to trying to control our skill in the same way as which we used to do when we first learnt the skill. So by using verbalizable rules. And explicit learning, when we learn in this way, where we learn about the declarative, the verbalizable ways in which we're performing our action, when we learn explicitly, it leads to a breakdown in performance under high pressure situations. But this isn't the case if we learn implicitly. And this is because knowledge is difficult to consciously retrieve after implicit learning because it's not available. We didn't learn it in that way. And so we're less likely to choke because that mechanism, it's not available to us. So we won't choke because we don't get into this situation where we try to use these old rules, less effective rules. So the three key concepts to learning this theory are working memory, implicit learning, and choking. So let's look at working memory. So we've learned in week one, all the way back in week one, that learning involves a change from going from conscious and explicit mode of control into an unconscious or implicit mode of control. And we characterize that first stage of learning in Fitts and Posner's model as the verbal cognitive phase. And this is characterized as having, controlled processing, a high level of attention is required to the different things we're focusing on, and we're trying to work out what's important to focus on. It's explicit, so we're able to consciously and verbally describe what we're doing, and we're using those rules to control our action. We build up declarative knowledge. We're able to say what those rules are. We're able to state them. And the phase is dependent on working memory, the use of working memory in order to develop these rules. And the final stage of learning in the Fitts and Posner model is that we go into this automatic phase, where it's characterized as automatic, where the action occurs relatively automatically with low levels of attention required to that process. It occurs unconsciously. We're not aware of what we're doing and how we're controlling our actions. And this involves proceduralized knowledge, so knowledge that's not consciously available to us, that we can't verbalize or state. And it doesn't require working memory in order to control actions. We don't need to think of a rule and then remember what that rule is and then deploy that rule while we're moving. We don't need to use working memory. So this concept of reinvestment theory, where one of the reasons why we choke is that we're in an automatic phase, and under pressure we start to use old rules or verbalizable rules, and this leads to a breakdown in performance. This is a theory that was developed by Professor Richard Masters, and you've read a couple of his papers by now. And he developed this concept that the reuse or reinvestment of previously learned explicit knowledge can occur under pressure, and this can disrupt automatic control processes, leading to choking. And he came up with an idea that, well, okay, if we don't learn those rules, if we don't learn these verbalizable rules, then we can avoid a situation or a mechanism through which we choke. And this is what he called implicit learning. So learning proceeding in such a way that we don't build up verbalizable rules. And it's achieved by preventing. He used a range of different techniques to try to do this. One of the first that he did was to prevent working memory from being available to manipulate rules and to develop that verbalizable knowledge early on or throughout practice. So he interfered with working memory to make sure that it's not available so that we can, not available to build up verbalizable rules. So there are different types of working memory, and if we want to prevent explicit learning using verbal working memory, then we need to come up with a way of disrupting this particular type of working memory. So the concept of working memory is that we have this a system which briefly retains and then allows us to manipulate different types of information. So, and And the image here that I'm taking, this concept comes from Bradley and Hitch, and it expresses two different types of working memory. And what we have is we have a central executive, so this is the central nervous system, or part of the central nervous system responsible for controlling our actions. And while we're doing a task or learning a skill, we have a system that temporarily stores information, one called the phonological loop. So this is information related to words or symbols, verbalizable working memory. And there's also a type of working memory called the visual spatial sketchpad. So a short-term or working memory system that allows us to store information about what we see and where objects are in relationship to ourself and our environment. And these systems store information that we experience, and we use that to help us to control our actions. And as we practice, this information gets consolidated in long-term memory. And so we over time we're able to remember this information. So these different working memory systems have different characteristics as well. So they're important to be and worth being aware of. So short-term memory related to the phonological loop, so verbalizable memory. Typically it can hold this information for about 1 to 60 seconds and allows us to manipulate abstract information, so symbols and words. And this is a capacity-limited storage system. And it's roughly we can store about 5 to 7 pieces or chunks of information and hold and manipulate those pieces in this short-term memory system for roughly 1 to 60 seconds. We're also consciously aware of this information. We can explicitly state what it is, and it's involved in explicit learning. So when we use these symbols during practice to control actions, we can later on recall what those rules were and how they helped us to perform our skill. There's also this short-term sensory store or visual spatial sketchpad, and this system is a bit different. It holds information very briefly, so less than 1 second, and it stores sensory information, so vision, touch, audition, etc. And the capacity is apparently limitless. So there's no particular limitation on the amount of sensory information that is stored here, albeit very briefly. And one of the distinguishing features between this system and the phenomenological loop is that it's very difficult to report and recall this information beyond 1 second. So it's a short-term memory store or a system which operates unconsciously, so at a level that is difficult to be aware of and verbalize. Okay, so to go into a bit more detail into implicit learning and how it links to and its characteristics. Implicit learning involves skipping the verbal cognitive phase. So instead of going verbal cognitive, associative, automatic, we just get rid of and skip this verbal cognitive phase altogether and go directly into an associative phase. So we don't learn verbalizable rules, and therefore we don't accumulate declarative knowledge about how to do or control our actions. In this sense, implicit learning is less attention demanding It doesn't involve working memory. And this is an important point, is that during practice, it doesn't allow for, it doesn't involve a process of hypothesis testing. So the person doesn't go, oh, if I do this, then that works, or if I do that, that won't work. So we don't develop verbalizable hypotheses about how to control skill. It's unconscious, and there's, in some respects, not necessarily an intent to learn. So the person learns without even meaning to, or consciously striving to learn. Performance after implicit learning, one of the reasons why it's beneficial is that it's more durable and it's less prone to forgetting. It's more robust against psychological pressure, against fatigue and dual tasking. It can work for people of different ages, so it works for old people, it works for young people, and it's IQ independent. So you don't need, you imagine a person who's very intelligent has a very good working memory, very, very good at understanding concepts and abstract rules. Those individuals don't have an advantage over somebody who learns implicitly. And another sort of a negative feature of implicit learning is that it's a bit slower. And this is because the person doesn't use some sort of a strategy or method that some sort of strategy that might give them an advantage. And therefore, they might be, operating and working in, I guess, a false minima or something like that. So learning is a bit slower. However, having said that, it has all these additional benefits in contrast. So what's this concept of choking? We're going to focus on how this theory helps explain choking and how we can use implicit learning to prevent choking. So choking under pressure, the reason why this occurs is because a conscious mode of control replaces the unconscious mode of control. If you remember in week 6, the control-based learning theory, we have different modes of control, and choking occurs when the conscious mode of control is used in place of the unconscious. And hopefully the concept of choking is intuitive for everybody. But let's look at some examples of choking in sport and why it would be beneficial to help athletes or learners in context of rehabilitation or physical activity or physical education in sport. Why would it be beneficial to prevent choking? All right, so let's have a look.
Through the final 2 quarters, J.R. Hildebrand. Careful of traffic. He's got to get around the loud traffic. What a figure. No! He hit the wall! Oh, my goodness. Keep your foot on the gas. Dan Weldon is going to win the race. That is unbelievable. Oh, my goodness.
White, 29.
Well, did he see the title there, Dennis?
Dear me, that was just a little bit of tension. But everybody's tense. Well, he'd miss one of those in 30.
What a grandstand finish this is. He's missed it! He's missed it! It's on the ground, he's missed it! Well, and there goes the whistle for time. What a dramatic, everybody's got their head in their hands, and he's sure in tears. He's in tears. He's a poor lad.
Oh, heaved into the leg side. Oh, West Indies, that helps. Oh, big shot.
Huge shot. Where's it gone? Into the stands. Oh, it's high in the air again. Oh, it's 3 sixes. Carlos Brathwaite! Carlos Brathwaite! Remember the name. History for the West Indies.
Roberto Baggio, the saviour of Italy throughout this tournament. He's missed it, and Brazil win the World Cup.
6 shots back, Nick Faldo should have been a mere passenger on Norman's final day lap of honour. But the only thing Norman hit effectively was self-destruct, while Faldo was at his competitive best. By the 9th, the lead had been halved, with Faldo accurate and efficient, Norman looking beaten and besieged. 3 holes later, the lead was gone. And at Amen Corner, where the cheers normally echo, the silence of sympathy was equally deafening.
A fancy tremor runs through the little pond.
I'm gonna stop it there. So you get the idea. The situations where the game is on the line, there's you have every advantage, but somehow the pressure of the situation leads to you performing much worse than your capability. This is choking, and we're going to look at how reinvestment theory, implicit learning, can help us prevent it. Okay, so this first question, how would you answer this first question now of, can you learn things without being able to remember them? What would you say in response to that question? Moving forward into the evidence section of the lecture, we're going to look at these concepts of implicit motor learning and EEG coherence, which is used to support this concept that we can use implicit learning to prevent choking. So there are different ways in which we can promote implicit learning. And one of the early strategies, and ones that you worked on and learnt about in week 6, is to overload verbal working memory so that it doesn't get involved in the process of learning the motor skill. It's distracted, or it's dealing with something else, so that the motor skill is learnt unconsciously. And this is the basis of using a secondary task or dual task during practice. So if you imagine you have somebody learning explicitly, where they're practicing to putt a ball, right? They're putting a ball to a hole, and you've given them that's the only task to do. That person is going to be like, okay, so what do I do here? I just keep my eyes above the ball, bring it back, bring the putter back and forward in a smooth motion, blah, blah, blah. So this person has all their working memory free and available to them to develop all these rules about what they're doing. So with a dual task, the goal here is to prevent them having that working memory system available to them. So we might give them a task like, okay, while you're practicing the golf putt, count backwards from 1,000 in 3s, right? And so the person will start at 1,000 and then 997, and they keep counting backwards while they're practicing the golf putting task. So their working memory is being used up for something else, so that the motor skill is learnt unconsciously, only via the visual spatial sketch pad, and not in any way using the phonological loop. So again, the goal of using the secondary task is to prevent the accumulation of verbalizable rules, declarative knowledge. Okay, so to go through an experiment that involved implicit learning and demonstrated how it works in an experimental situation, I'm just going to go through the first paper that demonstrated it. by Rich Masters back in '92. And so what he did was he had 3 different groups of learners, and he had one group learn a golf putting task explicitly. So prior to practicing the skill, they were given a set of rules in terms of how to perform the action. So, keep the eyes over the ball and all those sorts of things. And these instructions were taken from a coaching manual. He had an implicit learning group where no instructions on how to perform the skill were given. And they also, while they practiced, had a dual task. And in this case, it was the participants needed to generate a random letter every time they heard a sound. And then finally, they had a control group where there was no instruction provided and there was no dual task either. And after four days of practice for these 3 different groups, what we see is that the implicit learning group and the control and explicit learning groups, they improve through practice. What we see in terms of the performance of the implicit learning group, however, is they're worse than the explicit learning group, right? So they perform worse through practice compared to these other 2 groups, which is of course undesirable, and relates to that one of the descriptions of implicit learning, it being that learning will proceed slower. There was an important manipulation check that Rich Masters did with this experiment. So after the 4 days of practice, he also had the participants he asked them to state as many of the rules that they could think of in terms of how they performed the skill. And he counted up all of the biomechanical rules that the participants generated. And what he showed is that the implicit learning group, they had, on average, they could come up with about 1 rule that they were aware of for performing the skill. The explicit learning group had on average 6, could state on average 6, and the control group could state on average 3. So yeah, he showed that implicit learning is possible. We can improve our performance through practice while not developing many verbalizable rules about what we're doing, whereas the opposite is true with explicit learning. So the dual task, the secondary task, prevented people developing verbalizable rules. They then did a transfer test, right? And they had participants from these groups perform the skill under a high pressure situation. And so a high pressure situation, and basically what this involved was they put money on the table. So there was a reward, a possible reward, and this was designed to create a high stakes situation. And what they found is that the participants who were placed under a high stress situation, so the control group and the explicit learning group, the stressed explicit learning group. So we have the control group here. We see their performance deteriorates under stress. The explicit learning group with the triangle here, their performance deteriorated, and the implicit learning group with the diamonds, their performance was either better, was actually better in each case. So we see an enhancement in performance under stress with the implicit learning group, whereas we see a deterioration in the explicit learning and control groups under stress. They also did an important manipulation check again to see whether or not participants experienced anxiety. So the groups that were put under stress, their state anxiety was checked through a questionnaire, and they also had their heart rate being measured as well. So it demonstrated that the intervention had, this transfer test had the desired impact on the person's psychophysiological state. And with the implicit learning group, they're able to maintain performance despite this stress, right? And one of the reasons why this is that they think this is on the one hand, they don't control their skill using verbalizable rules, so they continue to control their skill automatically. And the other reason is that it might be that they have additional resources, cognitive resources available to them, because they're not using them to control their skill in order to manage and deal with the effect of that stress. So, for example, to maintain their attention on the task despite the stress. So this is why we think that the implicit learning supported performance under stress. Whereas the explicit learning group, they start to under stress start to use these verbalizable rules that they've learned early on to control their performance, leads to a deterioration in performance. They also don't have working memory available to manage the stress to maintain their attention on task relevant information. So there are a range of different ways in which we can circumvent or prevent the accumulation of explicit learning. So as I said before, with a dual task, what we see during the dual task is worse performance during training. So there are various techniques available to us to prevent that effect and yet still get the benefit of implicit learning. So one way in which this can be done is to use analogies. We learned a bit about analogies in week 6. So here you might use a metaphor to summarize a series of rules in a single verbalizable rule. So you implicitly learn all of these other rules by just learning one. Another approach is to use errorless learning. Okay, so with errorless learning, the way this works is a person will practice a task and it will be initially very easy, so they don't make any mistakes during practice. And then over time, as they keep practicing, you gradually make the task increasingly difficult, but their level of success is always very high. So they aren't allowed to make errors because the task is designed in such a way to prevent that. And what this does is, if we don't make mistakes, then we don't need to develop hypotheses in order to correct those mistakes. So it prevents the learner from getting into a process of hypothesis testing. And then another way that we can use is to use different tools that make the task easier. So we might scale the tool or the environment in order to facilitate learning without the need to use some sort of verbalizable rule to work things out. So, one of the experiments that I'll walk through now to show how this can work using errorless learning, but also demonstrate some evidence of implicit learning and how it works at a neural level. So what we're starting to see is neural evidence supporting this concept of preventing choking through the prevention of reinvestment, right? Or the possibility to reinvest verbalizable rules. So this concept of EEG coherence, first I want to explain what this is. So this is a study by Zhu et al. In 2011. And what they did was they put EEG electrodes on the scalp, on learners' scalps. And in particular, they were interested in two areas. So an area of the temporal lobe and an area related to motor planning. and also finally an area of visual control. So areas T3 and FZ. T3 is related to the temporal lobe, so where verbalizable memory is stored, and FZ being a motor planning area, and T4 being the visual cortex area, so at the dorsal towards the back of the head, and FZ being again an area of motor planning. And what EEG coherence measures is, okay, so if there are two areas on the head and the neurons in those regions are active, if they're active at the same time, so they're in synchrony, then this measure is higher. So when these regions are talking to one another, they fire at the same time, so they synchronize. And so a high level of EEG coherence indicates that two areas are talking to one another. If there's a low level of EEG coherence, it suggests that they're not interacting with one another. And what this study did is that they looked at, in a golf putting task, they looked at people who tended to consciously control their movements. They had them perform this skill, this task, and they measured, they put an EEG hat on them and measured the coherence between these regions. And people who don't tend to use verbalizable rules during the control of actions showed very low levels of EEG coherence between the verbal region and the motor regions, right? So they're not using this verbal regions. It's not being involved in the control of skill, which supports the concept that they don't tend to control their actions using verbalizable rules, so they're low reinvestors. Whereas people who tend to use and report using verbalizable rules, there tended to be there was a significantly higher amount of coherence between verbal regions and motor planning regions. Okay. And the way in which they measured the participants' level of reinvestment was through a questionnaire, right? So what they did was they had participants fill out this questionnaire. And so, for example, question 1, I remember the times when my movements have failed me. So if the person scored highly on this, it would indicate that they might be a high reinvestor. So if they score high on all of these questions, so the second question, I reflect a lot about my movement. They score high on this question, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. Those individuals would be someone who we would characterize as a high reinvestor, whereas somebody who scores low on these questions would be a low reinvestor. And this is how they created these different groups of participants. So in a second experiment by Zhu et al., what they did was they then went ahead and did an intervention study. So they followed up these initial findings with an intervention study. And how it worked was they had people put into two different groups, a errorless group and an errorful group. So the errorless group, essentially they practice, the errorless group, they practice putting at different distances, right? But they started out at 25 centimeters from the hole. So they start out doing it very easily. And then progressively through the experiment, the researchers progressively increased the distance to which they were putting to the hole. And so they experienced very few errors during practice. The errorful learning group, on the other hand, practice under a randomized schedule of practice. So we've got all these distances to the hole, and they were just randomized what they had to practice. So there were lots of errors during the acquisition phase in the errorful group. They then, after the acquisition phase, they then had a retention and a transfer test. So the retention test is under conditions that they've already experienced. And then they had a transfer test where they were placed under a high level of anxiety. So they were put under pressure. So they had if I remember well, they had a coach present. They put money on the table, and they tried to create anxiety in the learners. And what we see is that the level of coherence between the verbal and the motor planning regions in the errorless group, it's lower than the errorful group in retention. Not by a huge amount, but under transfer we get this choking effect. So not only did this errorful group perform worse, actually, they started to you started to see a lot of talk between the verbal and the motor planning regions. So they start to reinvest that verbalizable knowledge under pressure, and this leading to a deterioration in performance. So in summary, people who choke, when they choke, for instance, under stress, what we see is that there's a lot more left hemisphere involvement or activity during performance. So we see a lot more activity in these verbal regions, and particularly under stress. And this is associated with people who have learned a skill explicitly, or in people who like to control their skills explicitly. So chokers tend to have a lot of left hemisphere activity, whereas people who don't choke, they have significantly less compared to the chokers. Okay. All right, so take a brief break, and then we'll push into the final section of the lecture, looking at some applications. And you might take a break. While you're taking that break, just reflect on this question of, can people who have previously learned a skill implicitly start to learn explicitly? And why do you think this might happen? Okay, so now I'm going to explore ways in which we can apply these concepts of implicit learning to different sorts of groups, and how individual differences impact on implicit learning and these sorts of issues. In particular, we're going to focus on the nature of learning for elderly individuals in a context of implicit learning, and see ways in which we can apply these concepts to help old people learn safely, and implicitly. So we know that there's a relationship between reinvestment and the tendency to reinvest, and the number of verbalizable rules that we can describe when related to skills that we learn. We also know that the more rules that we know, the greater extent to which we are disrupted, our performance gets disrupted under stress, and therefore the greater the chance that we are going to reinvest skills under high pressure. And there's evidence even going so far to suggest or to show that people who are high reinvestors can show as much as a 30% decrease in performance as a consequence of that pressure, or as a consequence of the tendency to reinvest and think about their actions during the performance. There are also individual differences associated with tendency to reinvest. So if you get a sample of people with Parkinson's disease or stroke, or with a falls history, and you ask them to fill out one of these reinvestment inventories, they tend to score high on these reinvestment inventories compared to healthy old individuals. And so this suggests that there's a tendency to reinvest that is increased related to factors other than skill and learning, right? And it could be, for instance, that the onset of these conditions or a significant event causing an injury leads the person to, or causes the person to become perhaps more careful about what they do, pay more attention to what they do, and then start to control their actions explicitly. And this is unfortunate because these individuals, when you control your actions explicitly, it also increases the likelihood that you're going to have an accident or your performance will deteriorate in situations where it really matters. So in high pressure situations, maybe you find yourself, as an old person, you find yourself in a new environment. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of traffic, something like that. And, bang, you choke, let's say, under the pressure, and this means that you're going to fall over and break your hip, for example. Another reason why this could also be the case is these individuals, another reason might be that they have an injury, they go see a physical therapist, and the physical therapist helps them learn in a manner which is explicit, right? So for those of you, perhaps, if you've ever been coached before, if you've ever seen a physical therapy, if you actually listen and take note of the things that the ways in which they teach you, there's every likelihood that some of you have experienced, people training you in a very explicit fashion, which we know is not the most effective for preventing choking. So it could be the experience during rehabilitation that also increases this tendency to reinvest or to score highly on these reinvestment scales. So one way in which we can help older individuals to learn implicitly, but also safely. So if you remember from earlier in section 2 of the lecture, we had people, when they learn using a dual task, their performance during learning is deteriorated. And we don't want that. So if an old person has deteriorated performance during training, it might be unsafe. So we don't want this. It's not appropriate for older individuals. So we need a different strategy to help older individuals to learn. And one way we can do this is using errorless learning, which is, we could consider this a much safer way for helping an older person learn implicitly. And so these researchers, Chevelle et al., they looked at using errorless learning as a safe way of promoting implicit learning in elderly individuals. And they did an experiment where they compared younger individuals versus older individuals in an errorless learning paradigm. So they're learning to putt a ball to a hole, either at very close distances, this is the errorless learning condition, versus old and young people learning to putt a ball in an errorful condition where they're far away from the hole. And what they show is that during practice, through practice, young and old people both learn at the same, they perform at the same level during practice in errorless learning situations. So older individuals can learn just as well as younger individuals in these errorless conditions. However, in errorful situations or conditions, the older individuals perform much worse. So these older individuals, given by the filled squares here, performing significantly worse than younger individuals in errorful conditions. Another interesting feature of this study is that they showed that the older individuals who learned errorlessly also showed fewer declarative or less declarative knowledge. The researchers went a step further and also did a transfer test. And what they did was they had a group of older individuals who learnt errorlessly or errorfully. So errorlessly being over here, and the groups that learn errorfully being the ones over here on the right side of the figure. And they compared them to a group of older individuals who hadn't practiced at all. Okay, and they had all of these individuals do it putt at these different distances while doing a dual task, a secondary task. So where they're counting tones that get presented to them at random intervals while they're practicing. And so what we see here is that the individuals who practice perform better than individuals who don't practice. So older individuals perform better than people who don't practice, consistently across errorful and errorless conditions. Okay. So these open versus black markers, the open markers are the people who have practiced. When putting to a new distance, right? So this is a transfer distance, totally new distance. If you practiced under errorful conditions, right? And then you find yourself performing, needing to perform in a new situation, right? Also, while doing a dual task, your performance deteriorates significantly, more so than people who haven't even practiced, right? So these individuals under a new situation, they don't benefit from practice compared to people who haven't practiced at all. So their performance deteriorates so much that you're better off not even having been exposed to errorful learning conditions at all, right? That's what this says. This shows that you're better off not even having practice, and then needing to deal with new and stressful situations. Okay. Whereas people who have learnt in an errorless fashion, their performance is protected and totally fine when dealing with the dual task and when practicing performing under a new situation. Okay. So what this shows is that older individuals benefit from errorless learning, and it also shows that older individuals are beyond practice, are worse off practicing under errorful conditions or conditions that build up declarative knowledge or promote the use of verbalizable rules to control their actions. Okay, so given what you know about, now that you've gone through this part of the lecture, how would you go about answering this question? How can you help people learn implicitly and safely? It's worth going through these different points, these different questions also now that you've gone through the lecture material, and consider ways in which you've perhaps adjusted your answer to these questions given what you know now. These are the tasks that you should do following this lecture, and in order to fulfill the tasks for this week. And I invite you to also work through these learning objectives to help you revise and prepare for the final exam.